Hello, thanks for coming. Please join me in acknowledging that we at the Poetry Center stand on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. This afternoon, I have the great honor of welcoming Linda Norton and Fanny Howe to the Poetry Center. Both of them have new books, Fanny Howe's Night Philosophy and Linda Norton's Wite Out, W-I-T-E, out. They both deal in their own ways with, as Fred Moten said, how to take responsibility for horror. They record things, question notions of political urgency, whether it be family struggles or global injustice. How far did you get? Asked Linda Norton at the end of Wite Out. She was writing someone else's question here. Archiving the scene, she pulls no punches. With empathy plus lucid and penetrating wit, she asks difficult life questions in a Wite Out, subtitled Love and Work, a Memoir with Poems. Quote, Linda Norton breaks fresh ground as an autobiographical poem memoirist, all one word, writes Dawn Keene. From a poem, this is my favorite, in the book. Remember my limited palette, cracked panels and angels entering frames like explanations. Forgive my blue note, my halo, my shitty materials. Forgive me and look at me while I'm talking to you, or at least picture my face. Beyond category, wry, subtle, quote, quietly breathtaking, says Eileen Miles, author of the prequel, The Public Gardens, Poems and History, and a noted visual artist. Norton's writing has been featured in anthologies, and her collages are on the covers of books by Julie Carr, Claudia Rankine, and Stacey Zamazik. She lives in Oakland, California. Please give a warm welcome virtually to Linda Norton.
Hi, everybody. Um, Thank you, Norma. Thank you so much. And thank you, Steve, and everyone at the Poetry Center. Um, I'm going to read from Wite Out, and if there's time, maybe from a new manuscript. Um, I I mentioned to Fanny and Steve, they've seen many versions of this manuscript, and it would be nice for me if they'd forget all the embarrassing stuff that I've since deleted or revised. Um, Norma read from a poem there called Small Square, which is a kind of a arts poetica about making collages, because a lot of what I do is visual, but it's also about juxtaposing things. And the title of the book, Wite Out, some people ask about it. To me, it seems so obvious, but it's it's literally white out because that's how I started making my collages, with white out in an office in Midtown Manhattan in the 90s. But of course, it's also figuratively white out, erasure, and it's about the problem of whiteness. Um, and I want to read a little bit of James Baldwin, because I feel like this kind of captures the issues of the book. Even the most incorrigible maverick has to be born somewhere. She may leave the group that produced her. She may be forced to, but nothing will efface her origins, the marks of which she carries with her everywhere. I think it is important to know this and even find it a matter of rejoicing, as the strongest people do, regardless of their station. On this acceptance, literally, the life of a writer depends. James Baldwin, from The Discovery of What It Means to Be an American. And of course, the writer must constantly change the pronouns to include herself in all she reads, as I just did. Um, the book started out as a manuscript called Coloratura in 2015. It was maybe 30 pages long. And I was writing about reading, race, femininity, blood, voice, collage, and all kinds of color. I was reading County Cullen's book called Color, and I was rereading Nella Larson's Passing. And I seem to have been trying in the poems to write about these things without embarrassing myself or getting into trouble. And a year later, the manuscript was a long memoir in the form of diaries from the years 1997, 2016. 80% prose, 20% poetry, and most of the poems are prose too. And I published 2 essays called Ash Wednesday about my brothers, and the other called Pearl Paint about a former close friend. And eventually I figured out how to weave their stories into the larger narrative. So I mention this because I think that revision and recursiveness is a big part of what the book is about. And of course, it was how it was made. And my book is also about being a kind of fool, a conscious one maybe. And I'm reminded of this because I was a fool 2 nights ago and I did something incredibly stupid. So I'm reminded that it's a continuing struggle, but I will persist, as Blake suggests fools do. Um, so both my books are about putting everyone who matters to me in the same place, and that cannot happen in the United States. It cannot happen in my life, but I can do that in my books. Um, the first thing I'll read is Coloratura. It's something of a found poem. As I see quite a few demoralized coloraturas, I thought I should write. A singer needs to feel the ring in her voice, and before the color comes, she may not like the sound. I've seen singers cry, the mouth and face stuck. Now I can tell from the bathroom down the hall when it's about to happen. One student was mistakenly trained as a mezzo. A very upsetting situation, of course. This was the first time I had come across this, moving the head as if indicating yes or no was useful. I had a really lovely singer, a mature student, who did not know where her passaggio was, and another one trained as a lyric. This kind of instrument, when it is young, will tolerate a lot of punishment. A coloratura who doesn't understand her middle voice will find that the quality of the sound is compromised. Under-singing is never an answer to the problems. So the book has some sections that are only poetry called Feminine, My Singing Teachers, Translations for an Imaginary Audience, and The Burnt Lands, which comes from Gwendolyn Brooks, of course. And then it has sections of journals, like my first book. And this is from 2001, which is the last time I saw my parents. And my daughter and I were getting on a plane. And a month later, I read with Claudia Rankin at the Poetry Center. I pulled Isabel close to me and she looked up and smiled. Did she know we were fleeing? I don't think so. She was just glad we were going home. We were so early for the flight, I detoured and stopped in the North End to show her the places where we used to take Nani to buy her yeast and a grain alcohol and the flavoring for the anisette. I showed her Paul Revere's church and the old Sicilians eating pastry in the bakeries. We stood in the doorway of a pork store and inhaled the smell of the ancient wooden floor, the spices, the salami, and the Parmesan. And then we went to Logan to catch our flight. Only the desperate go to East Boston, Wieners wrote. From here, I could almost see the tenement where my mother was born. I looked down as we swooped over the South Shore. I was leaving the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries for good. A flight attendant, tall and blonde, brought a warm business class cookie for Isabel, and though it was not yet noon, he brought a glass of wine for me, the good stuff, the red they serve in first class, in a real glass, for free. It's too early, I said, but I guess he could see I was having a bad day. It's cocktail hour somewhere, dear. He was so sweet. I could easily imagine what he looked like in his 4th grade school photo, hair parted carefully and greased back, a few missing teeth. I gave Isabel a pad of paper and a pen. She asked me how to spell beauty and joy. I wrote them down for her. Then she proceeded to write the beauty of the joy on every page of the pad. Getting off the plane in San Francisco, I breathed in the smell of fog and eucalyptus. What was I coming home to? Difficulties, but better difficulties than the ones I'd left behind. September 11th, in the pharmacy, collective sadness, silence, except for an autistic boy who's waiting with his grandfather for a prescription. The boy is screaming and crying. The old man is holding him tightly and tenderly. No one looks right at him, nor does anyone move away from him. Isabel's poems. Mom, this living creature walks around the house not knowing what to do. Isabel, this wonderful creature walks around the house throwing back her pearls. And then 10 years later, the two main characters in the book are my daughter and my son, who came into my life in 2 different ways. And I met my son in Oakland when he was 17 in 2008. So this is his 21st birthday. I make dinner and a cake for him. He brings Rachel, his on and off again girlfriend. She is home from college in New England. Isabel listens and says little. Sometimes she's like this. And then later when we're alone, she talks a blue streak. She's just getting to know Marcus. And how does he feel about all of this? A direct question may get me nowhere. I'll have to wait and see and listen. He calls me a few days later. He and Rachel had a big fight. He threw a couch at her, that huge couch he found on the street and carried on his back for 20 blocks when he moved into that apartment with Harold. I hope his anger doesn't kill him or anyone else. Plenty of times when I would have thrown a couch if I'd been strong enough. I've thrown a lot of stuff, I told him. Salt, dishes, magazines, paws. My friend, the professor, once threw lentils at her husband. He laughs. And once, I say, I poured a cup of milk on my mother's head so she'd stop hitting my brother. It seemed the most nonviolent option at the time. What happened next, he asks. I think to myself, but do not say. She slammed the door on my hand and broke my finger and kept screaming, though I begged her to stop. Then she kicked me out and I had to sleep at the Falzone's house. That was the week I was supposed to be studying for the SATs. I answer Marcus. I don't remember. Then I suggest some ways to maybe not throw couches, techniques, anger management. And I think of Johnny, who would know how to help. In New York in November for a book party and a reading at PPOW Gallery, I say, it's All Saints Day. Eileen corrects me. No, it's All Souls. Coming out of the Met, walking down Fifth, I hear one brother say to another, I mean, this chick was so much fun, I forgot to fuck her. That's what I want in a woman, that kind of fun. I went down to Occupy today. I watched the police watching the demonstrators. One little cop who could have been my Sicilian cousin was wearing a regulation sweater vest over his regulation shirt. He looked like his mother had dressed him for a school photo. I smiled and said, I like your vest. He looked away. They have everything they need at Zuccotti Park, including a library with an anarchist poet librarian who knows Kevin and Dodie. I promised to come down again tomorrow to bring my book to add to the shelves. In Boston for book business, I asked my brother Richard to take me to the airport. It ends up being the opposite of a favor. We have to go drop the cab off with Victor, the guy who owns the medallion. And then Victor will take me to the airport, charging me full price. And I'll have to tip him well, hoping he'll be merciful to my brother. I take Richard out to breakfast before we drive to Victor's place in Watertown. And I give him $50. I'm in town to give a reading at Harvard, a most unlikely development. To paraphrase Langston Hughes, our neighborhood in Dorchester was as far from Harvard as Morningside Heights is from Harlem, a stone's throw across an abyss. Richard hasn't read my book. He's in it though. All of my brothers are in my book. My first book, that is. Especially our dead brother, also a writer. So I feel the urge to give, though I'm not making any money from the book. He shouts, authorette, authorette, and laughs maniacally. But never mind my book. It's easy to write a book, he says. He's going to write his own. It's a done deal. It's all written in my head. Just get me a contract. I'll give you a cut. I say, I'll see what I can do. I ask him to drive me into Mount Auburn Cemetery, one of my favorite places. The poet Robert Creeley is buried here, and Fanny will be, she says. We were both excited for a minute when she bought the plot, like we were going to a party. Fanny said, I can hardly wait. Mount Auburn is glorious in October when it smells like chestnuts and dusty leaves and books and apples. On the way to Victor's place, Richard says, Linda, when Victor gets in the cab, don't say nothing. What do you mean, I say? I mean, just don't say nothing. What, me? You and Ma and Caroline are always complaining about how quiet I am, how I keep everything to myself. Linda, don't say nothing. I'm the quietest one in this family. Well, he says, it's true. You are quiet, but sometimes you say outrageous things in a quiet way. So just don't say nothing. The book is dedicated to Fanny Howe, Alice Lyons, Bill Corbett, and Valerie Curtis Newton, and they all make appearances in the book. And of course, it's silently dedicated to my kids. And I'm almost done. And there's always the question in my books about what can poetry do that prose can't, and vice versa. So there's a lot of prose about Marcus, that's his pseudonym. And then there's this poem, which I wrote after I read Norman Fisher's collection of essays, which I love, called Experience. And of course, then there's Ralph Waldo Emerson's Experience. On your bicycle, skateboard, or motorcycle, or in that wreck of a car that makes poor people pity me, or at the bakery with hairnets and German chocolate cupcakes, where we met Ebony, who fell in love with her mother in a hot tub. And that time in the paternity ward in a gingham shirt I never saw again, where you laughed when I insulted a nun because of something she'd never done. You harangued by a beauty on the phone, you suffering in a shower stall. It is safer in a meat locker or at that wall near Marcus Books, another wall you improved, emancipated from care. With for or against, people need to listen, people need to speak, or dress up like the police, impersonating order, blowing things up on Independence Day and burning your hand. What to the slave is the 4th of July? This balm is made of Vaseline, this one you made of spit and samples from the paint store where you used to work. Black, white, and a little blue makes a color you call juice. That's JOOS, which is his tag as a writer. You may see it on walls around Oakland. And then I'll end with, I was very sick in March with what I guess was COVID for 3 weeks, coughing and everything, that we know about. And so like everybody else, I was on Zoom a lot. I was tutoring labor organizers at the time, and we worked online. And I started to make poems from the stacks of books that I would rest my computer on. Like today I have Robin Kelly's book of biography of Thelonious Monk. I have Mingus's Beneath the Underdog, Bill Corbett's new and selected poems. And it was a quote, something from Fanny's writing. I'm calling the manuscript now, which I didn't intend this to be a manuscript, but it turned out to be one. By combining chance with deliberate choice, I wanted to suffer on the page, Fanny Howe. So of course the poems, although theoretically made by chance, open any page, choose something from the recto, don't fool around with the choices. They do come together to make some sense. And the way they look on the page, I just heard David Naiman interviewing, it's an old interview with Tyemba Jess, and Jess keeps talking about the way Olio looks on the page, and it's hard to convey, isn't it, if you're not holding up the page. But this one was from a Zoom with Fanny and our good friend Susan Moon, and the stack of books included Philip Whalen, Kiese Lehman, Ezra Pound, Willa Cather, Don Powell, Susan Wheeler, Amber DiPietra, and Denise Lito, Stacy Samasic, Fred Moten, Claudia Rankin, Langston Hughes. And it's probably important to say that I didn't choose the books. Part of my chance was to just take the foot of books off the shelf, and they weren't in very much order, but now they are each a little community. So I'll end with this. Happy ignorance. I was definitely going to die during my baptism. Science fought till she got at the things. Small talk comes from small bones. The American occupation meant the end. Crowds of people hanging out windows in their undershirts. Dirty disestablishmentarian? Look it up. What is the word for things slipping into place, cut from kin? Nothing other than improvisation. I do solemnly swear. And she wasn't faithful to anybody, just like to love. Thank you.
That was amazing and beautiful, Linda. Thank you so much. Okay, Fanny. I would rather be lost in work than talking, said Fanny Howe in her interview last year with Janine Vivier. She says in another interview of her new night philosophy, it's a, quote, recapitulation with the purpose of seeing what was there. And in this new book, She is in the midst of urgent conversations with Simone Weil, J.M. Coetzee, Thomas Aquinas, Ibn Arabi, Robert Bresson, and a host of others. From the afterword by Chris Kraus, quote, working through the impending bind of syntax to consciousness, to justice, to extremity, to trauma, to abandonment, knife philosophy approaches complex, abstract questions by breaking them down to their most human level. Howe writes, quote, one definition of lyric might be that it is a method of searching for something that can't be found. Poet, novelist, short story writer, Fanny Howe is the author of more than 20 books of poetry and prose, and the recipient of many prizes, including the Ruth Lilly Prize for her lifetime accomplishments. Professor Emerita of Writing and Literature at UC San Diego, she has mentored a generation of American poets, activists, and scholars. Howe lives in Cambridge, Mass. Help me welcome Fanny Howe. Fanny.
Hi, here I am. Thank you, Norma. Thank you. I'm going to read actually from my two books of poems, both from Grey Wolf Press, one in 2014 and one in 2019. I know I'm not in the Bay Area now, but I feel, thanks to Steve and Linda, that I am. Perhaps I am still looking out the window of Susan Moon's front room window, or am up in the hills of Sonoma visiting our friend the monk at Sky Farm. But I'll pretend I'm seeing a line of friends from the years between, well, I would say from the cusp of the millennium. And a group moving of poets, Norma, Leslie, Lynn, Barbara, Simone, Etel, Grenier, Kathleen, Tina, Michael, Kevin, Benjamin, Stephen, Norman, all streaming through this unlocatable space on the bay. I see all of you there. But as we creep out from under the great beast that stalked our days and nights for the last 4 to 5 years, and the viral spawn of that beast which lingers, I feel its art, as it is sometimes meant, as a careful and cautious approach to a monster, the art of avoiding detection or notice, is the one that we are learning, and we have to learn it. My early childhood love of mythology is a help, especially of Hawthorne's telling of those stories and the pomegranate seeds that fell out of the colored pictures in the book of those myths. I remember the pleasure of allegory, surreptitious, running alongside the words, and how allegory doesn't shout and influence, but reveals a figure like a colored shadow, an accompaniment. This is what poetry and resistance has meant to me. So I'm just going to read a poem from Love and I, the first poem called Allegories. I love so many of them, but they're only half a decade away from being disproved. Remnants themselves already, like polar wolves from the vortex. It could be a nuclear site, but it's just a bar with the bottles going dark for the soldiers without uniforms. Its last model is reproduction. Is love one way? Almost always. It catches on a kiss, holds still for a flash. And then I'll jump over to second childhood, which means what it says for the book. Yellow goblins and a god I can swallow. Eyes in the evergreens under ice. Interior monologue and some voice. Weary fears, the usual trials, and a place to surmise blessedness. The garden. Black winter gardens engraved at night keep soft frost on them to read the veins of our inner illustrator's hand, internally light with infant etching. Children booked on blizzard winds, and then the picture is blown to yonder and out of ink. The black winter verses are buds and sticks. Parkside. Stone walls and chalk scratches for different ages. None of us could be sure now how many we were or where. There were hurtful pebbles, cracked windows, and bikes. We cut the butter and the day's bread evenly. We were children and a metal bed. 12 loaves and 5,000 baskets. 5 baskets, 12 pieces of dough. 12 times 5 and butter for a multitude. Bread made, that is, with 12,000 inhalations of leaven. I'll read this poem also from Second Childhood. This one is called A Child in Old Age. Every room is still a mansion to you, you who wants to live in an Irish hotel, to sit in a lobby beside the fire with your feet in a chair, to stare at the other children seeking asylum. Your brain is a baby, and all the ancients are in it still. Your heart is a channel and a crib for them. They rarely come down or out in the light, but steer you awkwardly with their cries. Your brain is still becoming an independent being, while your heart always needs air. I had an infant who was an orphan, who lived between my ears. Its sobs could only be heard when it circled the pump. How it hurt. Another infant lived like an octopus, fully exposed, with a skull like a bottle cap inside its thought. It was the arms of my heart. A heart is a mind that's only trying to think without an unconscious. The tentacle is a brain too, and its adaptable jellies just as intelligent as human blood. Sometimes you look into a baby's eyes. Bless her, you suggest to passers-by, yourself being old and unnecessary. But no one does. Please, you beg, the tears of an infant can be bottled and hidden for special occasions. One drop on your tongue and you won't ask for more. You've thought this somewhere before. And then I will end up with a sort of prose poem at the end of Second Childhood called A Vision. It's a little longer than those ones. Some old people want to leave this earth and experience another. They don't want to commit suicide. They want to wander out of sight without comrades or luggage. Once I was given such an opportunity, and what did I find? Mist between mountains, the monotonous buzz of farm machinery, corn stalks, brown, and flowers, then furrows, preparing to receive seeds for next year's harvest. A castle half ruined by a recent earthquake, still highly functional, computers, copying machines, and cars. It was once a monastery and home for our family, continually at war. Cypress trees and chestnut and walnut trees, a swing hanging long from a high bough, where paths circled down, impeding quick escapes by armies or thieves. I was assigned the monastic wing that later became a granary. Brick red flagstones, small windows with hinged casements, and 12 squares of glass inside worn frames. From the moment I entered the long, strange space, I foresaw an otherworldly light taking shape. Scorpions lived in the cracks. I came without a plan, empty-handed except for my notebooks from preceding days. This lack was a deliberate choice to see what would be revealed to me by circumstances. I took long walks that multiplied my body into companionable parts, down dusty roads and alongside meadows, and pausing to look at the mountains and clouds, I talked to myself. Mysticism provides a path for those who ask the way to get lost. It teaches how not to return, wrote Michel de Certeau. One day I had the sense that there were 2 boys accompanying me everywhere I went. I couldn't identify the boy on the left, but the one on the right was overwhelmingly himself, someone I knew and loved. The other one was very powerful in his personality, an enigma and a delight. His spirit seemed to spread into the roads and weather, silver olive trees and prim vineyards. Now a rain has whitened the morning sky, but every single leaf holds a little water and glitter. Mirror neurons experience the suffering that they see, a forest thick with rust and gold that doesn't rust. I saw a painting where the infant Jesus was lying on his back on the floor at the feet of Mary, and his halo was still attached to his head. And another painting where there were about 40 baby cherubs, all wearing golden halos. Gold represents the sun, as the sun represents God. Outside, wild boars were still roaming the hills, maize, sunflowers, honey, thyme, beans, stones, olives, and tomatoes. Rush hour in the 2-lane highway, oak leaves curled into caramel balls. A Franciscan monk sat on a floor reciting the rosary, a concept borrowed from Islamic prayer beads centuries before. Figs, bread, pasta, wine, and cheese, these are not the subconscious, but necessities. People want to be poets for reasons that have little to do with language. It's the life of the poet that they want, I think. Even the glow of loneliness and humiliation, to walk in the gutter with a bottle of wine. Some people's lives are more poetic than a poem, and Francis is certainly one of these. I know because he walked beside me for that short time. Whether you believe it or not, he was 13. That night I drank walnut liqueur, just a sip. It tasted like Kahlua. The inner wing of a bird is the color of a doe. And the turned over earth is the color of a nut and a bird. But soon it will be watered for the green wheat of spring. Flying up the hill on the back of the motorbike in the warm Roman air was like drinking from the fountain of youth. Umbrella trees along the Tiber. I walked on the rooftops across Rome, including a grassy one, and one where a pond grew out of a crack in the rocks. I was carrying an assortment of envelopes containing paintings and notes for my mass, but they could not be managed easily because their shapes were irregular. Some had juttings, some were swollen. The color red was prominent. They depicted divided cities divided into layers, not all in a line, a layer cake sagging under the weight of accumulated dust, dirt, and now grass. Each layer had been purchased at the cost of decades, even centuries, of hand-hurting, back-breaking slave labor. Caveat emptor. Broken columns, mashed marble friezes and faces. The triumph of greed was written across my storyboard. The city was a mighty and devouring creation, a creature with a crusted skin. Even in the city, you look for a place that welcomes you. You actually want to be found. Being found is the polar opposite of making a vow. You are a pot of gold and not the arc of the rainbow. When you sit down on a stone face up to the sun, you can't help but think, mine, mine. And you don't have to promise anything to anyone in time. You may be called to a place of banality or genius, but as long as it's your own happiness that responds to it, you're available to something inhuman. Mozart sat at the piano for the better part of every day. All over the world, monks have lived in desert hovels as scribes, prophets, mendicants. They are the extreme realization of one aspect of human personality that tends towards lack of possession and solitude. There was a hole in the roof of the Pantheon where we were told that the snow fell through onto the relics of Catherine of Siena, the mystic, and onto the porphyry. A man in Rome told me that a monkey climbed down a wall holding an infant in his arms. And in remembrance, there is a statue of the Madonna on the very rooftop where he began his descent. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fanny. Thanks to both readers. Amazing work. So wonderful to hear you both. And now, everyone who has a question will put their questions in the Q&A or raise your hands. But first of all, I have two quick questions, one for each of you. Linda, in your book, you say, "Why do I always still it slant?" Can you talk more about that?
Well, that comes from the section where I refer to, I think, maybe Dodie Bellamy's writing and Maggie Nelson's.
Yep. Yep.
And so when I mentioned the things that the revisions, I took some sex out, I put some sex in, then I took most of it out. And then when I read other people's writing, I say, oh my God, why can't I be more direct?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in that section of the book, I was more direct. I wrote it all in a notebook and then I lost that notebook. So I guess it's meant to be. So I think that's really very specifically about discomfort writing about sex, and
Yeah.
but still finding a way to say it. I hope.
Thank you. And Fanny, in your night philosophy, you talk about bewilderment. You say bewilderment is a poetics and a politics. Can you say more about that?
Well, the whole essay sort of is about that, which is that that rather than operating in a forceful way towards the world and what you encounter, you look at it with utter wonder, what is going on? And that becomes a form of political behavior if you question it rather than rush at it in a fury of opinions, which I do anyway. But ideally, you would be bewildered and wait to see.
Thank you. So are there any questions out there? Raise hand or do it in the Q&A. And I'll ask some more because I have some more questions. Maybe Steve has some questions, maybe Trey and Brent and Elise. But I'm thinking about home. And let's see, Eleni Dekopoulos was giving a talk the other day at UT Austin before the storm. And she was talking about immigration and immigrants and where you find a home, or if you find a home because you're from one place and then you go to another place. And maybe you could talk to each other about that, about the fact of home, or if there is a home, you're always in your work
Yeah.
saying that.
Well, I'll just say about Fanny and me that Fanny was born in Buffalo, but Cambridge is her home, and she's incredibly peripatetic. There's a poem in the book called "My Mystic" that's for Fanny, and I'm from Boston, but from a different aspect of it, and that is a bond for me with Fanny, is that connection, as well as Catholicism, including my anti-Catholicism. So I suppose at this age, writing a book like this is about trying to integrate the pieces and, gather up the fragments and make a home in writing. Again, like a place where everybody can be, that I can have them all in my books. And that's certainly Fanny's everywhere in the book, Eileen Miles, and the places, that I consider home. I would say I grew up in Boston, but I kind of raised myself in New York. I kind of gave myself the second upbringing that I needed before having kids in New York City. So that's kind of a home for me as well. And then Oakland. I mean, the other book ends with Brooklyn. And this book specifically focuses on Oakland and the public sphere and community. And there's a little excerpt from it on SF MoMA's Open Space, which was my last post there as a columnist in residence. And I chose those selections because suddenly that world was over. I couldn't go out and see people, and that had fed me so much. And we all miss that kind of thing. And so Oakland, it's like I just made Oakland my home because I have my funny little family here, my people. Yeah.
How about you, Fanny?
I'm afraid I'm not a people person, as they say. I never felt part of a group or a family except my own children. No, I tend to just want to wander and look at things rather than finding people to surround me. I have wonderful, wonderful friends, but I never would dream that we'd all be in one place together. There would be a grouping.
Okay, we have some questions. First, has sheltering in place during the pandemic changed your writing process or daily writing practice? If so, how? Fanny?
What? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You were
Has,
asking how has what changed? My
has,
writing practice?
has sheltering in place
Oh,
changed your writing practice?
no, because I think I'm sort of at the end of the line now. I'm writing less anyway. So I don't think it's changed that. It more is more about invisibility than writing things down now. I'm sort of interested in the way we disappear slowly. And I think there is something we're learning, which I sort of mentioned in that first little part I read about, we have to learn how not to let ourselves be watched and surveillanced every minute. And this is to me like a strange cooperation on the part of nature to learn how to live without being seen or found.
Yeah, yeah. Bishop Berkeley or Barkley said to see is to be seen, or to be seen is to be seen, something like that.
Really? Yeah, I'll have to find that.
Yeah.
He was, yeah.
So, to both of you, another question, kind of a vague question from Susan Moon. How does the pandemic and this endless sheltering in place affect your writing? Does it change the meaning of poetry? Well, the first part you actually did. So the second part, does it change the meaning of poetry?
I never think about meaning in poetry. I mean, as I was saying, I never really grouped up with people who are thinking wonderfully seriously about language and meaning. I picked it up by overhearing and sitting in. But poetry to me is in everything. It's like an embedded quality of a room, a tree. So no, that won't ever change any more than I would.
Yeah, yeah. How about you, Linda?
Well, for me, it's the pandemic doing these cloud of witness poems with the pedestals of books, the stacks of books, has returned me to poetry in a way because of because the prose in the other book was so consuming. And it's turned me back to poetry and the gaps, the lack of the need to explain things in poetry and line breaks especially. And I have noticed that almost every stack of books that I picked up since April had one of Fanny's books in it. So in a way, the manuscript ends up being a conversation with Fanny's work because I'm excerpting lines from it. And so that way, poetry is a way of being. I see Leanne's question about, is Fanny still a quietist? Poetry is a way of being quiet and alone, but being with all of you because I'm picking up your books. And I don't know if Laura Rickards is still in the Zoom session right now. She's a friend of mine, but her mother, Shirley Carter, has some lines in my manuscript because I just grabbed Shirley's book, colored, of course, and it's just another way of putting everybody together through the poetry. But it's, Fanny's Fanny's now by doing this, I've gathered all Fanny's books in one spot. I don't have her young adult novels, but I have almost everything else, I think.
We
Well,
have a question.
You're reading, your prose is poetic already. I mean, I wouldn't worry about refining anything. I think your work has got the beat, the emotion, the fractal quality already.
Yeah, I do want to keep going to the questions, but I just want to say that Fanny has been such a huge influence on the rigor with which I have addressed my subject matter in the book. And so have others, Julie Carr also, I can name other people. The questions are very hard, and I did depend, Steve Dickinson as well, I did depend on input, some of it pretty crisp input. And yeah, I love that Fanny started this reading with her catalog of her Bay Area people. So it feels to me that the event is very much about community and interaction and the absurdity of the way we have to do it now, but we're doing it, so.
So your conversation, Fanny and Linda, the conversation is a way is answering all the questions. So maybe you could do more of that.
Well, they're all good questions and from our friends over here. But Dana says, Linda, your work talks about several people who've died, and Fanny, your work addresses aging directly. Have these realities, death and growing older, changed how or what you find yourself writing? And I think just Fanny will say more, but she just talked about that kind of feeling of disappearing. And for myself, over the course of the writing, every time I would write about someone who had died, which is really mostly men in the book, I would, feel like, should I be writing about someone who's dead? And I would kind of look for signs, and I would sometimes get them, like Fanny says, whether you believe St. Francis was next to her or not, whether you believe it or not, most of those dead people found ways to collaborate with me on this. And sometimes they would seem to say, yeah, fine, do what you want. And other times like, you left out the most important part there, So I definitely was living with those who don't live here anymore while I was writing. And Fanny, what about you?
Oh, well, I guess the subject of aging, of course, is just because what I'm experiencing, and trying to not be complaining. And so to find it more interesting than a new complaint, since there's nothing we can do about it. But I think today is Ash Wednesday. And so I went over to Mass, and the priest now sprinkles the ashes in your hair instead of doing this on your forehead because of no contact. And I was wondering how all this is going to change the whole metaphysics of relationships that are rituals, because they are changing. And it's just all the empty churches and the empty places everywhere of all kinds are beyond our understanding now. I think we will understand it if we live long enough, in 20 or 30 years. But I don't see how we could now. It's like looking at the Gorgon or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Well, we have a question from Sam. Where is it? I can't see it anymore.
Yeah, I saw that too. It was something about, yeah, where did that go?
Why? Okay.
Sounds like a child.
Fanny
Yes.
from Stephen Ratcliffe.
Oh, right.
Yeah. When you lived in San Diego, when you taught there, then in Berkeley, when you taught at Mills, now you've been back on the East Coast for years. How does all that happen and work?
Well, it doesn't all the time. I made an awful mistake. I retired too soon and too eagerly from San Diego and ended up not being able to live on my benefits or whatever. So I've had about 5 short-term residencies or longer or more than that since I left San Diego to try to make things hold together. So I wouldn't recommend jumping ship before the shore in sight.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Fanny, are you still a quietist? Liam wants to know.
Leanne, I am, I guess. I mean, yes, I think I am. If it means you just lie down and wait, which is basically what it meant.
That's so good.
Yeah, really.
I would be interested in, since Fanny did go back to Boston, did go back to Cambridge and raised her kids there, you know, I would be interested in her answer to this question from an anonymous attendee. How has the influence of Boston on your writing changed as you have changed and the city has transformed over the years?
Well, it's pathetic because the city actually is like my parents. Boston is like an authority formation for me. And everywhere else I run to escape from them and from that kind of an oppressive influence. But I'm always then in a fury when I see how it's been changed, how East Boston has become aluminum and glass of the ugliest kind, the way the city has been taken over. And the little brick part is now like a theme park.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the part that I feel closest to. And it's not
Okay. The question from Sam, how to decide whether to write a poem or a book?
Those unfold. I think I remember being so happy when I read that Thomas Hardy would write complete, like automatic writing when he started a novel, and he'd write for about 50 pages, then stop and say, now it's time to start this book. And he'd go back and begin from the spontaneous eruption of the first writing of it. And of course, he was a poet too, and I think he then that same kind of spontaneity was contained like in a bottle when he wrote his poems. And he was discouraged because everyone was so brutal to him. The critics were. So writing poetry is a way of keeping everybody away.
And Linda, how about you? How do you
for me?
Yeah.
I guess it's narrative is prose, and everything else is poetry. Yeah, prose is a responsibility. That's how I see it. I never call myself a poet. I always call myself a writer. And, you know, in fact, you know, I immediately say, Fanny's a poet, Norma's a poet, Carol Snow is a poet, Cole is a poet, and many others who are here. But I'm a writer, and I just happen to write poems also. There's a question. Well, I didn't know that I was going to write this manuscript of poems during the pandemic. So it's also possible that if I'm not exercising so much control over an issue, that poems can come. But I had my issue and I needed to work it out. So there it was.
There's a question that asks, who is a poet? It's from Oliver Strand. Who is a poet from the past you'd like to talk to? And what would you want to say to them or ask them?
He could have asked me that question in person. But
He asked in conversation with all of us. So
I think Shakespeare seems like he would be so much fun. He's the one I'd love to be stuck with.
What would you ask him?
Yeah.
I hope we just tell jokes.
I would pick someone not famous. I'd probably have more of a chance of getting an appointment. With the character who is Johnny in the book, who I didn't really think of him this way, but later I learned some things, and somebody gave me a video of him making a rap video, and you do see in that book how much he loved language. And now I think of him as a poet too, and that I wish I could talk with him about that side of things, as I didn't in life. And I didn't talk about myself as a writer then either, because I was kind of a secret writer. So I wish we could have that conversation, you know?
Yeah.
There's one more question for you both. How do you know when a piece is finished? Do you go through a lot of revisions or just do it all in one go? From Paul Keoli. I'm not sure. I'm not saying the last name correctly. Paul Keoli.
I think if you're just writing all the time, you don't sort of make an icon out of every poem. I mean, it's better to just let it find its own way to an end. I think making it too important is a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
which can come with thinking where is the end.
Mm-hmm.
I think it should be compact in its sound, at least. It should be like making a partita or some little piece of music where the sounds all correspond. But I wouldn't know how to say where you should end a poem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For myself, I was so exhausted by writing this book, Wite Out. It required so much revision. I remember sending what was probably the same version I sent Fanny, I don't know, might not have been, to Julie Carr, and just realizing that I had to choose some themes in this book. You know, Fanny is my idol as a writer, but a very different kind of writer than I am. And that I had to choose some themes in the book and address them responsibly. And in this case, I made a craft choice kind of unconsciously in the first couple of versions, which was, it's in journals, so I'm just writing to myself, so I can't explain things to the reader. So I have to find ways to get all the information to the reader in a way that would be like I'm talking to myself. And there's a really cool Marcella Durand poem online about this. I'll see if I can find it and put it in the chat. But that meant that I had to spend a lot of time revising and working and making all the the parts answer each other, and and of course then you're also trying to create a tolerable narrator, which is based on me, a flawed protagonist. So that I wouldn't do it again. Let's put it that way. I'd find it a simpler way of working, but it had to be done for that.
Well, it's a wonderful book, no matter what an agony it was to write it.
Yeah, no matter. It's actually, I just had to do it, and I'm glad I did it. I couldn't have lived without doing it, frankly.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look for that Marcella Durand poem while you guys talk.
Great. There's one more question from Susan Moon. It seems that all this zooming and technology is robbing us of a sense of place. Do writers have a particular part in their job of keeping our love of place, ground, season alive? Do writers have a particular part in that job?
I think, well, I've always been a great lover of descriptive prose. The garden, if someone can bring it to life for me reading the way, I would go back to Thomas Hardy or Emily Dickinson to that those eruptions of nature around a thinking person. Those to me are critical for keeping you alive. Even just to read them is good. So I would say we need to write about nature in wonderful ways. And whatever we noticed when we were in childhood and saw instantly was beautiful. That's sort of the kind of goal now, is to keep doing that for other readers in the time we're in. But I honestly think in some ways Zoom is saving our imaginations and not bottling it. I think without it, or not, not specifically Zoom, but this metaphysical space we're all having to inhabit is kind of enlivening to our thoughts, our ability to imagine it.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned his name, and I'm not going to right now. But now that he's gone, I find myself able to concentrate more and read books, because I feel like there are actually people in the White House who are doing their job. So for me, this time of slowness has been good for concentrating on books. And I do feel very, very close to some of my friends on Zoom, and I wouldn't have imagined that, that somehow we do it. The Marcella Durand poem I mentioned is called To Marcella Durand by Marcella Durand. And remember, I mentioned it in the context of, he says, see, a musician named Sonny Rollins, see, if I were writing to myself, I would not be explaining that to myself. A musician named Sonny Rollins treated the view from this bridge as a composition sheet. He read the city lights, and she goes on. And then the last line is, making a composition from the city of others that is about me. And not, I realize only a few people here have probably read my book, but you could see why I would strongly identify with that beautiful poem, because that is, like the Frank O'Hara and me, the star of the poems,
That is it. That's great. Well, we want to thank you for your fabulous readings and talk, and for the rigor with which you both bring to writing and talking about writing and your work and just being in the world. Thank you so much.
Norma.
Norma,
yes.
Norma, thank you. Your presence, great.
Yeah. And you all have been so good to us. And Norma, those were beautiful introductions, so incisive. Yeah.
Thank you. It's all your work. Thank you.
I'm getting texts about your introductions.
Okay.
Well, we send love. Peace.
How do we get off?